Hello, and welcome to Revolutions in Communication, a textbook and university course about the writers, photographers, rebels, and visionaries who were ahead of the times, who led the times, and who created the times. I'm your instructor, Professor Bill Kovaric. Today we're starting a new section about the time when electronic media were new, starting with the telegraph and telephone, and then moving to radio and television. So these are chapters 7, 8, and 9 in your textbook. As always, a lot of the supporting materials are available at the website www.revolutionsincommunication.com. Electronic media represent an important dividing line in history. Before the telegraph, which was the first electronic medium, all forms of mass communication, including books, magazines, newspapers, prints, engravings, photos, really everything, was created and transferred on physical media, either on paper or on film. It was durable and portable, but it was slow and not very easy to copy. Now, after the telegraph, we're dealing with electrons moving at the speed of light. They are easy to amplify, broadcast, duplicate, and change. The telegraph was important to people in the 19th century. Here's an 1876 Currier and Ives print entitled "The Progress of the Century." In the background, we have a steam press on the left and the steam locomotive and steamboat on the right. But in the center foreground is the telegraph. And notice the message, liberty and union, and glory to God in the highest. It's the kind of lofty rhetoric that often comes with the introduction of new technologies, especially new communications technologies. One reason that the telegraph was such a big deal is that throughout history, rapid communication over long distances has been pretty difficult. It was even associated with divine forces, for example, in Greek and Roman mythology with Nike and Hermes and Mercury. Now, for ordinary mortals, communication has historically been confined to the speed of a horse, a running messenger, or a fast ship. History and literature are full of references to the role of messengers bringing the long-delayed news of victory or defeat. The runner from Marathon, the messenger in Shakespeare's Henry IV, the signal flags of Trafalgar, these are all among the many examples of the importance of distant communications in pre-industrial history and culture. Probably the classic example of news failing to arrive on time is the Battle of New Orleans, which is fought between the armies of the United States and Britain on January 8, 1815. The soldiers and the generals in the field could not have known that a peace treaty had been signed just before Christmas of 1814 in the city of Ghent, Holland. It took 7 weeks for the fastest sailboat to carry the news from London to British headquarters in Mobile, Alabama. So the idea of a telegraph starts with long-distance signaling, and the first system that we're sure about is called the Polybius Square. It's named for the historian Polybius, who wrote about the histories of Rome and Greece around 150 BCE. Now, the square divides the characters of the alphabet so that they can be sent via flags in the day or lanterns at night. Here's how the Roman army used the square. They would have 5 square flags and 5 triangular flags mounted on 12-foot poles. By raising the right number of square flags, they'd have one column indicated, and the right number of triangular flags would indicate a position on a row. So for instance, the signal for S might be 3 square flags and 4 triangular flags. During the American Civil War, the U.S. Army Signal Corps came up with the wigwag system. It was binary, and of course binary codes were used later in computers. Here the soldier in this contemporary illustration is wagging right, which indicates the number 2. Now, left, right, left, that is 2, 1, 2, would be the letter S. This interesting system was invented by Albert J. Myer, who was a surgeon and became head of the Signal Corps. You may have heard of Fort Myer, right next to Arlington Cemetery, which is named for him. Now, for more about this interesting system, there's a link on the web page in Chapter 7. Naval flag signals apparently go back to the dawn of recorded history, and there have been all kinds of systems. Probably one that we're most familiar with today is called the Popham Code, which is named for Captain Popham, who published his first list of code words and sentences in 1799. The Popham Code was used when Admiral Horatio Nelson sent this message to the fleet just before the Battle of Trafalgar, October 21st, 1805. Now, it's interesting that newspapers at the time said he addressed his fleet by telegraphic communication with a famous message, "England expects that every man will do his duty." This interesting word, telegraph, comes from the system developed by Claude Chappé in France in 1792. Today we refer to it as the optical telegraph, and it was very useful, although limited by visibility in bad weather. The first optical telegraph ran from Paris to Lille near the English Channel. It would take 9 minutes to send a single character and half an hour to send a message of moderate length. This, of course, is much faster than a courier on horseback. What we're looking at here is an illustration from a Paris magazine from 1901. The optical telegraph became increasingly sophisticated with lines all over France, and similar systems were introduced in most other European countries. The French continued it until 1855, well after the electric telegraph was firmly established. And it's interesting that the French would also hang on to another early sophisticated system, the Minitel computer network, which was established in the 1980s and utterly swamped by the internet and the web. And they hung on to it until about 2012. Electricity first begins to come into the picture in June of 1752 when American printer and scientist Ben Franklin raised a kite to test his theory that lightning was similar to the charge that could be generated with his chemical batteries. By the way, this is an extremely dangerous experiment, and kids, do not do this at home. All right? Electricity continued to attract attention as a way to send signals at a distance. Telegraphic systems were invented in Germany and British India around the 1830s and 40s, but they weren't commercialized. In Britain, in 1837, William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone patented a complex telegraph sending and receiving system that used 5 wires and a pattern of letters that could be selected or read through indicator needles on either end. You know, it was difficult to read and nearly impossible to repair. History today may record Samuel F.B. Morse as the inventor of the telegraph, but as we have seen, there were already many kinds of telegraphs in use during the early 1800s. What Morse really invented was the software, the Morse code, that made it easy to use a one-wire telegraphic device. It was a key insight, similar to Gutenberg's invention of movable type, and not the press, or Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web, which became part of the existing internet. These and many other cases show a rising technical capacity that's held in reserve until an inventor or many inventors start to have these key insights. By the way, this is a photograph taken at Matthew Brady's studio in New York in 1857. As we learned in Chapter 4 of Revolutions in Communication, Morse taught photography to Matthew Brady. So the heroic posture here is really Brady's homage to his teacher. So what motivated Morse during the time he was inventing the telegraph in the 1830s and early 40s? He was a portrait painter and artist, and he taught photography at NYU. His obsession about long-distance communication had nothing to do with military power or the stock exchange. Instead, he was actually motivated by his wife's sad death in 1825 in childbirth. He was in Washington, D.C., painting a portrait of the Revolutionary War hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, and she was dying in Connecticut. So the letter informing him of her death took 5 days to reach him. And it was a cruel blow, and it was made worse by the gap in communication, he said. So after his wife's death, Morse spent years studying art in Europe. And on a ship homeward bound in October 1832, he began talking with other passengers who were interested in electromagnetic experiments. Pacing the deck after dinner one night, he came up with the idea of sending signals through wires and sketched out his ideas in a notebook. Morse developed his code by thinking about the most commonly used letters in the English language, and to be sure about that, he checked with printers about their type fonts. E is the most common letter, and typically printers would stock 12,000 of them in a font. Z is the least common letter, and a typical printer might only stock 200 of them in a font. So, in effect, Morse code is a software solution to a hardware problem. Here's a daguerreotype of Morse. And it's kind of ironic that Morse wanted to use Daguerre's model for diffusion of this innovation. Daguerre, you might remember, gave away all the rights and patents to photography as a gift of French science to the world in 1839. Morse wanted to be like Daguerre, and he hoped that the government would own the hardware and the patents to his telegraphy system. But as it developed, over 500 telegraph companies emerged and fought and then merged by 1866, and telegraphy became a national monopoly under the Western Union Company. So Daguerre's ideal was inverted with Morse's telegraph, which became one of the very first controversial monopolies in America in the 1870s, long before the Rockefeller Standard Oil monopoly or the Kessler Whiskey Trust. Telegraph lines raced across North America. These maps show the telegraph network as it existed in the US in 1846, and this next one is in 1853, only 9 years after the very first message that Morse sent, which was, of course, "What hath God wrought?" By this time, only one state east of the Mississippi, Florida, was not connected by telegraph. The telegraph is also connecting Europe with America by 1858. Here's a cartoon from August 28th, 1858, and it shows Johnny Yank and Uncle John Bull shaking hands across the Atlantic. It's a crude but kind of engaging picture, and it's celebrating the goodwill between Great Britain and the U.S. Brother Jonathan, the American, says, "Glad to grasp your hand, Uncle John. May the feeling of friendship be like the electric current which now unites our lands and links our destiny with yours. We yet shall see all nations speaking our language, blessed with our liberty, and led by the spirit of love and justice, which leads to the only true happiness and glory of nations." And John Bull responds in kind and says, "I hope we will both agree to let bygones be bygones." Of course, this very first telegraphic effort failed because the science of long-distance signaling and the resistance of the copper cabling was not really well understood, and the signal just died out in late 1858. So they actually, during the 1860s, had to find scientists who were willing to study the problem and who would make recommendations about the kinds of systems that they really needed to use. By 1866, the telegraph was firmly in place and working well, and they started wiring up the world at that point. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Pony Express, but it was quite famous, and yet it only really lasted a year or so. People were moving out to California during the Great Gold Rush, and they needed to write letters home, and usually those letters would have to go down to Panama, go overland from Panama, and then go up the Caribbean on sailing ships, and it took a long time to do that. So this system of relay riders with the Pony Express short-circuited that long journey for the mail. But of course, quite soon the telegraph crossed the United States, and there was no need for a Pony Express. During the Civil War, the telegraph wires hummed with reports and orders and news, and it gave the Union war effort a critical advantage. After the war, the telegraph helped build and break fortunes, and along with the railroad, altered the way Americans thought about time and space. The telegraph was Abraham Lincoln's medium. Just like Thomas Jefferson had the newspaper and FDR used the radio, Lincoln used the telegraph to control movements of troops, to promote and demote generals, and to stay informed from hour to hour. It was really the first time a commander-in-chief could communicate in real time with generals in the field. Lincoln also made sure that newspaper reporters had access to the lines so that dispatches about action on the front could go through. So in both ways, both in terms of public information and control of the army, The telegraph was crucial in Lincoln's administration during the Civil War. There were a lot of social impacts with the telegraph. Futures markets and railroad timetables became much more stable, and news coverage changed. An example of changing news coverage is a comparison between William Howard Russell's letter to the Times about the Crimean War's charge of the Light Brigade and Henry Villard's report from Bull Run only a few years later. But the difference is the telegraph. Now, the wire service's condensed telegraph style became a journalistic gold standard where we emphasized facts over opinion. But it did not always obscure opinion, as we've seen, for example, as Villard says, our troops commenced. Anyway, the short, punchy style of writing was lionized by writers like Ernest Hemingway, for example, who called his writing telegraphese. Not everyone loved the telegraph. Henry David Thoreau was a great naturalist and writer, a very important historical figure for environmentalists, and he had a very skeptical view of all technology. He believed that we should take the time to walk rather than earn the money and then buy a train ticket. He also believed that hasty communication was bad communication, and he thought of the telegraph as cheapening and rushing the national conversation. This same skepticism about the quality of communication in any new medium is typical of the rhetoric that surrounds the emergence of new communications technologies. We all know that telegraphy and telephony were personal media, but why are they mass media? This new electronic communications system allowed the creation of an infrastructure for news agencies and what came to be called wire services. And just in the same way, the telephone system became the network infrastructure for radio and TV. Here's a photo of an old-time wire service machine from the 1950s. It can transmit as well as receive. As you can see, there's a keyboard there. By the late 1860s, the telegraph companies converged into one large system called Western Union, and the news-sharing organizations converged into the Associated Press. Morse's fear that the system could be controlled for private gain had come true. Some people loved the AP and others didn't so much. Mark Twain said in a 1906 talk, "There are only two forces that can carry light to all corners of the globe, the sun in the heavens and the Associated Press down here. I may seem to be flattering the sun, but I do not mean to do so." And some people really dislike the system. This cartoon is from a left-wing publication called The Masses that saw the AP monopoly as being used to spread lies about labor conflicts in the West Virginia mines. Remember that AP only passed along news that was reported by the newspapers, and at the time the newspapers were owned by the mine owners, and there was no voice for miners in the West Virginia. Given the power of the telegraph monopoly, many people became alarmed. The U.S. Congress considered 96 bills and resolutions and 48 committee reports about the telegraph and AP monopoly between 1866 and 1912. This photo, by the way, shows a Western Union telegraph delivery boy taken in 1910 as he learned Morse code between deliveries. It was taken by Lewis Hine as part of his campaign against child labor. Will Irwin wrote about newspapers for Collier's Magazine in 1911, and he said that many problems with newspapers really could be traced back to the Associated Press monopoly. Meanwhile, conditions in Europe led to a different kind of system. First, the government post offices ran the telegraph systems themselves. They weren't private like Western Union. That meant that a telegram in France or Germany cost about half as much as in the US. It also meant that wire services were easier to set up and were more or less protected by governments. Charles Louis Havas is really the first entrepreneur who starts to see information itself as a commodity. He begins writing a newsletter and using homing pigeons to deliver news, but he quickly adopts the telegraph when it comes along. Paul Reuter was one of his main disciples, and the Reuters news agency is the main wire service for Britain and the second largest in the world after the U.S. Associated Press. The alternatives to the Associated Press only caught on briefly. And here on this page and the next, there's a timeline for wire services of the world, starting with Havas in 1835 and going through a lot of them that are national wire services as well as independents. The hope for an alternative to the Western Union monopoly is what led to the development of the telephone. Garner Hubbard was the leading lobbyist for a postal service telegraph law, and he was also the father-in-law of Alexander Graham Bell. He said the Western Union monopoly was a power greater than any ever wielded by the French Directory because, in an era when public opinion is omnipotent, it can give, withhold, or color the information which shapes that opinion. It may impart an irresistible power to the caprice of an individual. After Bell secured his patent for the telephone, he wanted Western Union to license it and approached Western Union with that idea. Their response was classic. The idea is idiotic on the face of it, they said. Why would any person want to use this ungainly and impractical device when he can send a messenger to the telegraph office and have a clear written message sent to any large city in the United States? Ironically, the telephone also became a monopoly and then merged with Western Union to become American Telephone and Telegraph, known as AT&T. AT&T mounted a large successful public relations campaign to avert the antitrust breakup, the kind of thing that happened with Standard Oil about the same time. Now, the antitrust breakup did come along, but 70 years later. Meanwhile, the telephone system, as we will see in Chapter 8, started carrying radio networks across the country. One of the things we can learn about technology is that it often follows a cycle that can be described in stages: open, closed, and alternative. The first stage of the cycle involves open experimentation, competition, and development of new media. It might be followed by a second stage in which stakeholders close the technologies around profit-generating activities protected by patents, and we're going to see this with Marconi's radio system. If the stakeholders are successful, they may be able to dominate the market. Then, in a third stage, successful monopolies become stagnant, charging more and more money for fewer and fewer services. The downward spiral then often spurs the search for circumventing technologies as alternatives to the old monopoly. So once a promising new avenue is found, the open competition starts again. As we have seen, telegraphy went through a period of open experimentation and then closed around the Western Union monopoly. The telephone also went through an open period of experimentation and then closed around what AT&T called a natural monopoly. When Alexander Graham Bell neared the end of his life, commercial broadcast radio was just beginning, and you have to wonder what he was thinking in 1922 when this photo was taken as he listened to the newest medium. Thanks, and I'll see you next time for more revolutions in communication.